Well, hello everyone. A different kind of message from Brussels that I'm going to send out to you today. I'm joined by a colleague of mine, a friend and a fellow member of European Parliament, Jonathan Arnott. Jonathan's got some really interesting new ideas that he wants to get out there, and I think at the moment there's so much sterility in the debate in politics, particularly in the debate in politics in our part of the political world, that it's time that we opened up this discussion and started looking at some new and radical and really frankly exciting ideas. And Jonathan's done a lot of work on a new document that he's bringing out, and I want to ask him a little bit about that today. So I'm going to take on the role of the interviewer for once, which I'm looking forward to. And Jonathan, so thank you very much for this. One of the things in your document which I find really interesting is you've got an interesting idea on VAT and what you do to replace it.
Okay, well, first of all, I think the whole idea of this is that we need to try to be innovative. We need to try to think of new ideas. Certainly with Britain leaving the European Union, that gives us an awful lot of freedom to be able to do things that perhaps we wouldn't have been able to do whilst in the European Union. So VAT is this vastly bureaucratic tax where it's being paid, reclaimed at various points during a manufacturing process. And that adds huge amount of cost onto British business. And also it means that you get that sort of carousel fraud where it's very difficult for any tax inspector to make sure that the money that's being charged at one point is actually then accounted for exactly the same. So you get lots of fraud. I just say, you know what, once we leave the EU, we regain the power to be able to deal with these things for ourselves. So one thing that I think we should do as a matter of urgency, really, is to scrap the VAT system and replace it with a simple purchase sales tax in the way that countries like America already do. So it cuts huge amounts of bureaucracy, but also at the same time, it cuts a large amount of fraud.
This is exciting because we're already talking about something that we can achieve outside of the EU. And this is the beauty and the interest in this. We must stop just banging on about the process of Brexit. There has to be something at the end of it, otherwise what's the point? And Jonathan's got some fascinating ideas here. I mean, I love anything that's to do with scrapping a tax, so I want to thank you for starting us off with that. But then we move on to one that's really, really interesting. There are deprived areas in our country, areas where there's been a lot of concern that EU funding, which we all know is just recycled taxpayers' money, is going to be denied from those areas. Jonathan's got a fascinating new idea on how we deal with that and actually, through freedom, get more enterprise into those areas. Could you talk us through it?
Yes, and again, if we don't talk about leaving the European Union as something where we can do something differently in our society, then again it becomes sterile. And I think one of the problems that we've seen in the Brexit debate is we've focused so much on potential problems, on negotiation of deals, but we haven't had this positive vision for what the future actually looks like once we leave the European Union. And so there's been this sort of defensive mentality where people have talked about, okay, so out of the membership contribution that we send to the European Union, at the moment we get funding back in regional development funding, the EU social fund and so on, which generally is concentrated on deprived areas. It doesn't necessarily have the impact, the level of impact that I would like money that goes into our deprived areas to have. But what if we start to be radical and say that that money that we're giving at the moment, what if we tried to use that money in a different way, in a better way, in a way that would create lower tax zones in those deprived areas, so that it's not the government, the state that revitalises, regenerates your deprived areas, but actually it's then business. Let business regenerate our deprived areas and create employment. So one way of doing that is to take those savings, and if you're moving to a purchase sales tax system anyway, then why not reduce the rate of purchase tax in those areas so that it's actually cheaper for businesses to sell, it's cheaper for people to buy in those areas, and of course with appropriate constraints. I mean, you don't want Ferrari and Lamborghini to suddenly decide they're going to headquarter themselves in the UK in in somewhere that's deprived. You don't want to, so you probably put a cap on the maximum purchase price of a good that you can do that way, and you probably also have something to prevent distance selling being done that way. But actually, you know, if a business is going to set up a new shopping centre or something, why not give them a real incentive to do that in our deprived areas? And actually, it cuts the cost of shopping bills for people there. Now, as long as you get it right and you don't overdo it and you don't do it in an overzealous way that really does completely distort the economy, actually you're doing it by a tax cut that helps the poorest people. And I just think that's the way that you help people. It's not through more and more and more state intervention, which has failed. It's actually through giving a real helping hand by taxing people less.
This is the kind of radicalism that I find exciting. I mean, what you're talking about really is a variation of trade, not aid. It's competing your way to prosperity. And I think that's fantastically exciting and a new way forward. But there are other areas in Jonathan's paper. It's not just on some of these tax and economic areas that he's done some work. He's got a really interesting vision on crime and punishment, which I'd like to invite him now to just give us a bit of a rundown on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to talk across a range of policy areas because I think that's what we need to do. We don't need to be a single issue or have a single focus. On crime, we hear so much from the left about rehabilitation, and it's not wrong. I mean, of course you want to make sure that people who come out of prison are rehabilitated. But what I want to see now is for some teeth to be added to that system. So I've always talked about early release in prisons, and some people say that if you scrap all early release and make sentences mean what they say, that says something about criminal justice. Well, it does, but does it actually do something about reoffending as well? What I want to do is say that for any prisoner who wants early release, firstly, they should have behaved themselves whilst in prison. Secondly, they should have committed to working on developing their education, developing their employability, developing their skills. But thirdly, and absolutely vitally in my view, those people need to have actually got a job, found themselves a job to go to once they leave the prison system. And we provide targeted help to businesses to assist them in doing that. But let's make sure that people who come out of our prisons do so and go into a job, and let's genuinely break the cycle of reoffending. That's what I like to call rehabilitation with teeth.
I like it. Another exciting one, another really new idea here, which is it's absolutely challenging the convention. What are your views on immigration?
Well, firstly, you separate refugees and asylum from the general immigration system. Generally, immigration is about economics. It's about bringing people in who have the skills that are going to benefit the country. And that's something that's irrespective of whether someone's from the European Union or not from the European Union. You make sure that anybody who comes to the UK can prove that they're not a criminal, that they've got a good background, that they can speak English or at least learning to speak English. So all of those things to make sure that society is protected. And you have a points-based system for most people coming to the UK to make sure that the people who come are people who will make the UK a better place. But also sometimes there are situations where maybe a restaurant might want to bring in a specialist worker who doesn't have a degree, say, and it's actually worth a lot to them to do that. Or somebody who's rich might want to come to the UK. So one thing that I'd like to see is a visa auction scheme which allows people to buy visas for those who do meet the vetting requirement, but then that brings in a new tranche of revenue into the country, which would pay for increased patrol of our borders and also pay for what we want to do in terms of refugees and asylum. Now, the people who we should be allowing into our country for compassionate reasons as refugees, they're not the people that you find in Calais who've gone through safe country after safe country. You don't know whether they're genuinely fleeing civil war in Syria or not. They're people who've had the money to be able to pay people traffickers. No, the people we want to help are actually the people who are the most vulnerable, the people in refugee camps in places like Jordan and like Lebanon, and people who are displaced, the most vulnerable people, the women, the children, the elderly, the infirm, the people who are from oppressed minorities in those areas. Those are the people that we really want to help. And actually, if you have that visa auction scheme, then you're bringing in the money to be able to do it. So I actually think that gives a real way of funding how you help the people who are most in need. And I think British people would understand that a lot more than they do when you see people coming from somewhere like Calais, and you know that those aren't really the most vulnerable people in the world.
Superb, a market-based solution to many of our issues there. I'm loving this. Final one of the points for now, just to get you a taster of what Jonathan's work's been. What would you do on the tax thresholds?
Well, I've always said it's ridiculous to have tax on the minimum wage. Nobody who's working on minimum wage on a standard working week should be paying a penny piece in income tax. This is something that I've said for many years, and it seems to have dropped off the political agenda. And what I've tried to do in this document, which I'm calling Britain Beyond Brexit, you'll see there, this is my sort of prototype, as it were. And what I've tried to do throughout this document is talk about where we can cut costs, where we can cut bureaucracy, where we can cut quangos, where we can save money. And one of the big things that I want to do from all of that kind of saving is to say that then let's raise that tax threshold dramatically to 15 grand a year, so that the people who are on the lowest incomes aren't paying anything in income tax. And if you really want to help the poorest people and make work pay, a great way of doing that, of really making work pay, is to stop taxing the poorest people in our society.
Fantastic, thank you, Jonathan. That's just a taster, a few points. There's a lot more in this document. We're going to be getting the document out there for people to see. Think of it as something to stimulate your thoughts, get your mind going. There's a lot to think about. This Brexit situation could be really positive for our country. We've got to think of new ideas, new ways where we can make our country a better place than it is. And I think there's some brilliant food for thought in this document. So please look at it. Britain Beyond Brexit by Jonathan Arnott. It's going to be out everywhere we can. Please come back to us, ask questions. I, for one, think it's a superb piece of work, and I'm really, really delighted that Jonathan has shared some of that with us today, and I'll be promoting that as well. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll check in with you again soon. Cheers.
Okay.